I've met an awful lot of angry people in the wake of the global financial crisis, but some of the angriest people that I've met have been people who work in the alternative investment industry, in private equity or in hedge funds. And the reason they're angry is because they're getting the blame from a lot of people, and they're also facing a raft of new legislation, the biggest piece of which is something which is working its way through the European system. Now, Cass Business School has one of the leading academic thinkers in the world of private equity, Guy Fraser-Sampson. I asked him if it was an industry that needed regulation.
Yes, I think it's very difficult to argue that hedge funds do not need regulating. I think there's been concern about their role, for example, as long ago as the Asian currency crisis in the late 90s, and certainly also concerns that with short selling and the way in which they deal, which we could talk a little bit more about, they did perhaps contribute to market turbulence in 2007 and 2008.
If that's the case, why are people objecting?
People are not really objecting to the hedge fund industry being regulated. The problem is that the European Union are taking a very broad brush approach, and they are attacking lots of other people, such as private equity funds, that really do not need regulating at all, that are completely different to hedge funds. They're effectively confusing the two.
Why are they doing that?
It wasn't really apparent until about 2008 when these rumblings really started in earnest, just to what extent people confused hedge funds with, say, private equity funds or other types of alternative investment funds. In reality, they're very different indeed. For example, hedge funds deal in public markets, whereas private equity funds, as the name suggests, do not. They take shares in private companies. More than that, hedge funds use derivative instruments, they can use short selling techniques, and they also use a lot of leverage in those positions. So there certainly is scope for making abnormal market conditions worse.
Do you think the private equity industry has done a good job of getting its case across?
Judging by results, I think the answer has to be no. I mean, I wasn't part of that process, so I can't comment as an insider. I think part of the problem is that the private equity industry in Europe has to speak with one voice, because that's the way in which their representation is set up. And we've now arrived at a situation where I think it's strongly arguable that private equity may no longer be just one discrete asset class. We have a very small number of very large firms that we might call the mega buyout funds. And arguably what they do now has become so different to what other private equity managers do that they could, I think, justifiably be thought of as their own asset type, certainly, if not an asset class. And that's the problem, because rightly or wrongly, and I happen to believe wrongly, but rightly or wrongly, the regulators blame those mega buyout funds for being part of the problem. As I say, I think that's wrong. But it's very difficult then for the private equity industry as a whole to say, yes, but the rest of us are actually something completely different.
But ultimately, why shouldn't there be rules? These are big, powerful industries. Surely it makes sense for there to be some rules regulating them.
But that's just the point, you see. All private equity funds are already regulated. Most hedge funds are not. Many hedge funds around the world are completely unregulated. And when you think it's the hedge funds that are dealing in public markets and derivative instruments, the private equity funds which are making private unquoted investments, then that seems a very strange state of affairs. For example, any private equity firm that operates in the UK is already regulated by the FSA, no matter how small they are and no matter what they do.
What other asset types might be caught by these new rules?
Well, the regulations are rather strange. They define an alternative investments fund not by what it invests in, but by whether or not it is what we call a UCITS fund. And the UCITS regulations are really designed to facilitate the marketing of funds to certain types of clients in certain situations. So they really have very little to do with what the fund invests in. But the specific examples they give do include things like real estate, which again seems a slightly strange one, and commodities. So I think it would be safest to assume that right the way across the investment spectrum we're going to see these regulations.
Ultimately, what are you concerned about? Is this something that could destroy the private equity industry?
It's going to be very difficult for smaller private equity firms. It's going to impose an added cost on them of complying with these regulations. And the problem is that there was an exemption that was argued for, which has not been granted by the European Union. The European Union has exempted any fund manager that does not use leverage, that has a portfolio of less than 500 million euros. Now, the problem with that is it clearly relates to the manager, not to an individual fund. So managers may well have older funds with older investments in them that take them up over that 500 million limit. It would have been much more sensible to limit this to individual funds of less than 500 million. In fact, you could have done it for much lower than that. If it's individual funds, you might even have said 300 million.
I know you've written a new book. Is this part of the subject matter?
It's certainly mentioned, but no, the book is much more about how to invest in alternative asset classes.
Guy Fraser-Sampson, thank you very much.